Hello, everyone. Welcome to Toronto Apologetics. My name is Tony Costa, and glad to have you guys along tonight to join us on this program. We are going to be having our guest on shortly. Dr. Daniel Brubaker will be joining us momentarily. He's just having a couple of hiccups, and so we will be starting very, very shortly. So just to give you guys a heads up, tonight we are going to be talking about the corrections that have been made in the manuscripts of the Qur'an. And Dr. Daniel Brubaker is a specialist in this particular area. And so in this video, we're going to be discussing these various issues. And so I'm going to be bringing Dr. Brubaker on very, very shortly. Just want to remind you guys to subscribe to Toronto Apologetics and like the video and to share the video as well. And so I'm going to bring Dr. Brubaker on. Hello, Dr. Brubaker. How are you?
Hello. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you. And I understand you had just had a couple of hiccups there.
Yep. There's always a hiccup, isn't there?
Yeah. And also a happy birthday to you as well. I know that you just
thank you.
You just turned 25. Is that right?
Just 25. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Moving along quickly.
That's right. So, and I know tomorrow's your Thanksgiving, and of course here in Canada, our Thanksgiving is on the second Monday of October. You guys have it at the end of November, so I kind of wish we had your Thanksgiving, because it's a nice segue into Christmas.
Well, did the Christmas decorations go up right after your Thanksgiving as well? Or?
No, that's considered a serious offense up here. We usually get it up, I guess, the first week of December. But anyway, we just got started, Dr. Brubaker, and we wanted to discuss the topic of your book. On I had it here in my library somewhere, but I can't find it at the moment. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about your background? I know you did your doctorate in Islamics.
Yes. Specifically, I did my doctorate in religious studies at Rice University, and I focused on Islam. Different people in that field would focus on different religious traditions, but mine was on Islam, and then I chose my topic to be specifically focused on the Quran itself, textual criticism, and so forth. So, but the degree itself is not in textual criticism of the Quran, nor is it in Islamics per se.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And so can you say a little bit about your book? I think it's called 20 Corrections to the Manuscripts of the Quran. Do you have a copy of it here?
Sure, I have a copy of it here.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah. It's called Corrections in Early Qur'ān Manuscripts, 20 Examples.
Okay.
A little bit of trivia. Originally, it was titled 20 Examples of Correction or something like that. But somebody advised me that I should put the corrections part as the main title and the 20 examples as the subtitle, which I think was a very wise decision.
Right. And so maybe can you explain to us why you wrote that book? And I know it had to do with your research in the manuscripts. So what was the motive behind the book?
Well, my book is just a very small sampling of my doctoral dissertation, and I'll show you what that is, what that looks like.
Okay.
Benefit of everybody seeing me walking around here, but this is the doctoral dissertation itself.
Yeah. Wow.
Whatever, a hardbound version of that, and it's just got many hundreds of examples of Quran manuscript corrections. And as time was going on, and to my shame, we're now 10 years out from my doctoral defense, and I still have not published the big academic book. Okay. But I wanted to get out at least a sampling of that material, because time was moving on. I thought it would be useful to people, and typically somebody post defense of their doctoral dissertation would publish the academic book first. I just decided to go ahead and do this one. It's semi-academic. I mean, I wrote it to be not fluffy, but also not inaccessible to people.
Right, right. So, can you tell us a little bit about these corrections that you noted? What does that say about? Because the common mantra we keep hearing from our Muslim friends, as you know, is that the Quran has come down to us in exactly the same way it was revealed to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel. There's no changes in the wording. There's no changes. Some have even said no dot, even though there were no diacritical marks in the oldest copies of the Quran. They claim that it has been a homogeneous text. It's never been altered. It's never been changed. And as you know, they usually use that argument for polemical purposes to basically downgrade the Bible. Say, well, the Bible has all of these textual variants, but the Quran is a miracle because it's come down to us without alteration.
Yeah, well, that particular claim is not, it's actually a more modern development. If you would be to time travel back to the first couple of centuries, you would find more openness to the level of variation that existed in the Quran manuscripts. In fact, we have, literatures that are, it's called the Masahif literatures, and there's the Qira'at literature, but there's also Masahif, like Kitab al-Masahif ibn Abi Dawood, deals with that. They understood that there were variations in the manuscripts, and they sought to catalog them and account for them. The variations that I've discovered are a little bit wider than the ones that are acknowledged in that literature, but the point is that this more recent adherence to a doctrine, shall we say, that the Quran has been transmitted perfectly without a dot or a letter ever having been changed, is something that's nice sounding, but it's usually said by people who just think it would be useful to have that be a fact because it helps to strengthen their case. It isn't rooted at all in any particular truth about the Quran itself. And not that it's particularly my concern whether it was or wasn't, but I think that the movement is then to try and bolster that claim, with the emergence of more of the manuscript pictures and so forth. To bolster that is to go back to a claim that, the oral transmission was perfect, and the manuscripts were whatever they were. People were fallible, and therefore. But we know the oral transmission was perfect, which we can talk about a little bit if you'd like to talk about that. I think that's
that'd be great.
Well, my again, it's not my concern to say it was preserved or not preserved. I know people talk about that, but my observation to a statement like that, however, is that the only evidence that we have of what was orally preserved is is the written manuscripts. We don't have tape recordings or MP4s or anything going back to the time of Muhammad. We have no way of knowing that except what we see in the in the coins, in the manuscripts, in the inscriptions on buildings and so forth. And so we have to rely on those things, and that's what we've been doing.
Right. I think you've just frozen a bit, just your video there, Dan.
Sure.
So,
could you hear the audio of what I said? Okay.
The audio is faith comes by hearing. So
yes. Okay.
So you frozen there, but at least we can hear the audio. So no, that's very interesting and helpful. Can you maybe talk about? There's been a lot of talk about the Birmingham manuscript. Do you know about those manuscripts, Dan? And Muslims are claiming that they go back to the time of Muhammad. Is there any truth to those claims?
The Birmingham folios, interestingly, that is one that I have not yet visited in person.
Right.
Several other people have. Alba Fideli is the one who famously wrote and published on that, and so forth. But I will go there and see it at some point. But that manuscript belongs to, as I recall, it belongs to the same one as the Paris BNF Arab 328, which also has some sections that are in the St. Petersburg Library. It is Hijazi. It's an upright format page, vertical page, written out to the edges. It's in what's the type of writing that's called Hijazi, and there are others. In fact, there's one in Iran that I just became aware of that has the Mashhad Codex that has that's written in that style as well. So that's typically placed into the late 7th century. I'm not currently brushed up on all the where we land. I mean, some of the radiocarbon dating has actually placed it even before Muhammad was born. Some of these manuscripts, not that one necessarily. I'm sorry, I don't recall if that was the one, but it might have been. So that raises questions about, well, I mean, about the time period in which it was written. It's possible that a piece of parchment was written sometime after it was actually produced, after the animal died. But yeah, I think Tony, the thing just comes around to the fact that there are a lot of things about the origins of Islam that we kind of think we know, that tradition has told us is true, about Muhammad, about his life, about the Quran, about its history, and so forth, that are a lot less set in stone than tradition tells us. We like to have everything wrapped up neat and tidy and think, oh yeah, we know how it happened. But the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of things kind of up in the air, and we're thinking about them and trying to do it responsibly and carefully and fairly, as good scholars. But the situation is that there are a lot of great questions to be asked and answered.
Right. Well, as you know, Dr. Yasser Qadhi made the famous remark that there's holes in the narrative when it comes to the compilation of the Quran. What the Hadith says, he says there's a lot of questions about that. So I think even Islamic scholars that are academically trained, I mean, Qadhi's graduated from Yale. He knows that the evidence shows that there's this, what we're being told from the mosques or from the imams is not what scholarship is saying in terms of how the Quran was compiled. And so you see this a lot with Islamic apologetics, like Sheikh Uthman and many others. Shabir Ali, whom I've known him since the early 90s. We've interacted at least 12 times. We've had dialogues, debates. He has now come to I think he knew, but he can't deny it any longer. I mean, we've got internet access. They could research this online. Back in the day, you'd have to go to a local library and photocopy documents and so forth. But I think more academically trained Muslim scholars are coming to the realization that, yeah, what we're being told and what we see in the actual manuscript history are not the same thing. That there are a lot of questions, a lot of holes in the narrative, as Qadhi says.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I recall that I wasn't watching when that happened, but I of course did hear about that. But I think that, can you hear me and see me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm trying to turn off my notifications because it keeps binging here. I'm not sure if that's annoying everybody else, but it's annoying me. And I never know how to do this on my computer here.
I thought I was the only one, Dan, but okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's annoying. Yeah. Not to me, not yours. I mean, mine, when my wife forgets to turn the notification off. Yeah.
Do you know how to do it on a Mac? I'm sorry to interrupt.
I don't, you know what? I'm a PC guy. I'm a politically correct guy. PC. No, I'm just kidding. No, I don't know how to work it on the Mac.
Okay, that's fine. Well, we may just have to put up with it.
That's fine.
You can just chalk it up to my lack of technical ability on a computer.
That's okay. That's
all right. Yeah. So his, of course he understands. Most everybody that attends. Now, I've only been in conferences with him a few times, but we do kind of cross in the same circles.
Yeah.
But everybody knows who's academic working in this area that the manuscripts are manuscripts. They're handwritten. They have textual issues in them and so forth. That is just a fact of dealing with these things. So yeah, he knows that, and I don't know. I mean, I can't see into his mind to discern exactly what was in there when he said that holes in the narrative, but I kind of see through and understand, that it was a very, obvious.
Yeah, it was an interview he had with Mohammed Hijab, who's an Islamic apologist out in the UK, and he was just saying that he was basically saying, could we reproduce the same text that was given to Muhammad? And Yasser Qadhi was basically saying he didn't want to go there because there's a lot of questions about how that material was compiled, and then you've got Uthman burning all these other copies, and then there's Ibn Masud and Ubay bin Ka'b. They were very reluctant to hand over their scrolls or their copies. And so Qadhi basically said that the standard narrative that we hear from our Muslim friends, there's a lot of holes in them. So that was his point. So he was tacitly admitting that, look, Western scholars have poked holes in that narrative, and so the Uthmanic recension is just one of them.
Yeah, that's right, and I think that was a moment of honest admission that he probably didn't want to be forced into that corner, but there you have it. I mean, as a scholar, if you said otherwise, you would be going against. Yeah, it's interesting. Even the senior scholar in Turkey, Tayyar Altıkılıç,
yes,
made a response to my work too, but in reading his introductions to these critical editions, not critical editions, these facsimile editions that they've been making of manuscripts, I mean, he admits a lot of things in there that many ordinary Muslims would find disturbing or shocking or whatever. But so the academic world and the sort of the world of common knowledge is just a different space.
Yeah.
So so there you have that. Now I think I'm not surprised. I mean, if you were me to ask me what I think of the fact that there are variations in the manuscripts, number one, variations exist in handwritten manuscripts because humans are humans.
Yeah.
So I would be shocked if there was a manuscript tradition that was flawless and perfect in every way.
Mm-hmm.
I think the problem, as I've reflected on this over the years, the problem that Muslims have is that they don't have a miracle. Muhammad didn't have a miracle. And so the Quran has to be the miracle. And the Quran, is for Muslims is a miracle in mainly two different ways. One way is the text itself, the all-surpassing beauty and rhyme and number structure. People have made different arguments about the text itself. And then the other one is the argument that it has been perfectly preserved, and God would, only God could do that.
Right.
So the second argument, I think, is the one that gets challenged by the work that I'm doing with the manuscripts, and I'm not the only person who's doing it. Other people are doing it as well. But but that kind of falls apart under that situation. Is it a fatal blow to the Quran? Well, I mean, if you've spent your life resting your confidence in the text of the Quran on that claim, then that would be a very jarring thing, I would imagine. Now, as Christians, you and I understand that we have a manuscript tradition of the transmission of the Bible down to us that has been placed under a microscope for a couple hundred years, and we now know we don't claim that any of the translations. Well, I mean, you and I don't think claim that any of the translations are inspired. There are people who believe that. But the belief is that as they were originally written, that they are the inspired word of God. The word of God and in the words of men. So it's a little bit of a different situation. And if Muslims had that view about the Quran, then they might be in a different position in relation to the whole thing of the transmission. But the existence of many variants in the manuscripts does not pose a problem for you and I.
No,
in the biblical manuscripts or the biblical text.
Right.
I think the bigger issue, and I want to answer your questions about the manuscripts and the changes as well as we talk, but I haven't spoken much about the content of the Quran, but I think the bigger problem for Muslims is what the Quran contains, what it says, and the claims that it makes, which are both internally problematic and problematic with respect to the Bible. As you know,
Right.
the Quran disagrees with the Bible while claiming to confirm it. And I don't even know what that means when you confirm something, but then you disagree with it.
Yeah.
So, and of course, the foundational issue is how somebody is saved. How is somebody justified before God? And Romans 3:20 says, by the works of the law, no flesh shall be justified.
Right.
That's about as plain as it can be. And the Bible is quite clear about that. And so, it kind of breaks my heart to see people placing their trust in some sort of belief that they can justify themselves by works. Because, if you rely on that standard, you're going to lose every single time.
Absolutely.
Unless you're not some human person, but I think most people doing that are humans.
Right. Right. And
so, anyway, that's kind of a sidebar, but it just a little reflection that I haven't made that frequently in my public facing comments.
Yeah, and I think that every other religious tradition out there, I think, maintains the importance of works salvation or works righteousness, and the Christian faith seems to be unique in that it claims that it is God who saves us through faith in Christ and not by any works, and that the law of God, of course, has its place. It shows that we cannot save ourselves. It points us to Christ. It points us to the cross. It shows us that we are inept, or our righteous works are like filthy rags. And so it drives us to the cross, to the Savior. And that, of course, is something that is unique in the sense that all religions has been said that we're all trying to build a bridge to God. And in Christianity, especially with Christmas around the corner, the whole idea of the incarnation was that God came to us. He didn't wait for us. He came to us, and he created he brought the bridge to us. He formed the bridge to us, and so that is I think one of the most beautiful things about the Christian gospel is that God so loved the world. He gave his son, so that if we believe in him, we won't perish. And it does break my heart too, Dan, because as you know, our Muslim friends reject the cross. They reject the crucifixion of Jesus, at least traditionally. And of course, without the cross, there's no resurrection. There's no empty tomb. And so the gospel is completely undermined. It's sabotaged.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So in your work, Dan, in your book, you do talk about corrections and alterations. Can you expand on that? On what do you mean by corrections? Are you talking about the palimpsest, the Sana palimpsest? Are you referring to other manuscripts of the Quran? So what exactly do you mean? Because I know you said some of them have been like they've erased them or almost taped them over, and
yes. So most early Quran manuscripts of any length, and by any length I mean at least a couple of folios, will have some sort of textual issue, whether it's a variant that exists in the text or some correction, post-production correction that exists in it. This includes, of course, the Sana palimpsest that you mentioned is very interesting because it has an upper text and a lower text.
Yes.
By the way, I just heard this week that, I don't know if it's how old the news is, but it was new to me this week that the famous blue Quran,
oh yes,
is apparently a palimpsest as well. Now I've held pages of that in my hands as well, and I did not notice anything that indicated that it was a palimpsest there. But that's kind of an interesting development. But the fascinating thing about why the Sana palimpsest is so interesting to scholars is that the lower text of that, the one that was washed off to make way for the new one, is Quranic text or looks to be Quranic text, but is variant in some significant ways from the Quran that we have today.
Right.
So there's speculation about that. Now, Asma Hilali has worked with that. I believe Alba Fideli has as well. And maybe some of the others, other people in the field, Eleanor Szilard and others have done this work. But I haven't focused a lot of attention on the Sonnet Palimpsest myself. I haven't been to see it, just because other people have worked with that and, very nicely documented what's in it. But we'll be cataloging all those things into, the larger analysis at some point. But yes, so according to the standard narrative, which I'm not even sure, none of us know exactly whether that's how much of it or what of it is true.
Right.
But Uthman, the third caliph, became aware that the troops were disagreeing about the Quran, and he had the existing manuscripts gathered together. He commissioned the production of an authoritative one or ones, and then had the others destroyed. And so there's some speculation with things like the Sonnet Palimpsest as to whether that might contain, maybe they didn't destroy it by burning, maybe they washed it off and rewrote it or something like that. So
Right.
that's an intriguing possibility in those cases. But that episode is really interesting in itself. Just the fact that the claim exists that we had to standardize.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know if you want to talk about that for a minute, but that's
it always puzzled me, Dan, that and Bukhari tells us that episode where Uthman, the troops came back saying we're arguing over the readings of the Quran, and one of them said, lest we become like the Jews and the Christians. And then Uthman gets Zaid bin Thabit, I believe, to collate the manuscripts of the Quran, and one of the statements was made was that's like trying to compile the Quran is like trying to find something in a haystack, like a needle in a haystack. And it has always puzzled me that if the Quran was always memorized correctly, it was passed down by memorization, what would be the need to standardize the Quran if the Quran has always been a homogeneous text? I mean, I can understand, King James producing the King James version to produce an authorized version for the churches because, he didn't like the Geneva Bible. It was very anti-monarchical. And so, the Geneva Bible referred to kings as tyrants and so forth. But
yeah, we don't like that if we're a king, right?
Yeah, and I think the Pilgrims,
or a tyrant.
Yeah, when they came to the U.S., I think there's a reason why the Puritans loved the Geneva Bible. But the idea being that if the Quran has always been the same and it's never been changed, then why would Uthman have to destroy other copies? I mean, today, if you burn a Quran today, you'd be accused of Islamophobia, and hate crime, and Canada is notorious for that. The U.S. I think is getting there, but your Constitution is much stronger than our charter up here. But
gotta have the First Amendment, guys.
Yeah, I love the First Amendment. I mean, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, Dan, I don't know if you've read it. There's a notwithstanding clause in there. And so the government, you saw what happened during the pandemic up here. The government basically froze people's bank accounts. They threw people in jail. And they basically called the police in force, and it was horrible what happened in Ottawa. Yeah, and so the idea here then is, what always puzzled me is, number one, why would Uthman have to standardize the Quran if it has always been the same? And the common answer I usually get is, it's the whole question of tahrif, is the kirat, that it was revealed in 7 different ways. You could read the Quran in 7 different ways. Now, I may be wrong, Dan, but to me, that sounds more like a cop-out. Can you maybe explain, again, why would Uthman have to standardize the text? Number 2, this idea of the ahruf, the different readings, did that evolve out of this tension with Uthman?
Yeah, so there are different things to be said about that, and I still need to catch up in my reading of Shadi Nasser, who is the authority on the Qur'an. Now, the Qur'an were a considerably later development, at least in their standardization. Now, the Muslim tradition has back projected that to say that they always existed, that they were revealed from Muhammad that way.
Yes.
But again, we can only go from what we have written down. And the earliest Quran manuscripts, the Hijazi ones, like the ones that we have just been talking about, are there are very few pages that have no diacritics on them, but for most, they're very deficient in the diacritics. Now, the diacritics don't even tell the readings for the most part. It is the other markings, the Fatha, Dhamma, and Kasra, and other markings that would indicate the different readings. And so one of the problems is it doesn't really make sense in those early manuscripts. If the readings weren't marked in the first place, what would be the problem with because you can do those different readings from an existing Hijazi Quran. For the most part, you can do any of those readings. It isn't telling you to read it one way or the other. There are, I think a couple of readings that maybe involve the long vowels or whatever, but so yeah, I think it kind of falls apart on that. The fact that he needed to gather and destroy and create a standard just speaks to something larger, and that, to me, that speaks to something involving the consonantal text, or not even the consonantal text. Consonantal text is even a little bit too specific. The skeletal text, the rasam, which yeah. So yeah, I don't think that explanation. I mean, it makes sense if you're trying to tell a story, but it doesn't make sense if you're trying to do scholarship on what happened and what caused or precipitated that.
Right. And so when we look at, there's, Jay Smith has done a lot of work in this area too, but when you look at the Hafs and then the Warsh and then the Duri, and there's all these different versions out there of the Quran. The Hafs is the most well-known. Can you say something about that, Dan, about these different versions that we have of the Quran? I think Jay Smith counted over 30 of them, 30 different versions from around the world. Can you say something about that? The Hafs, the Warsh. I know the Warsh is big in Africa, and maybe shed some light on that.
Yeah, well, I'll begin by saying that already when we're talking about Qira'at, it's completely after the time period that I focus on. I focus on the first couple of centuries, and it doesn't even make sense to talk. So I'm aware of the Qira'at. I know them. I have several of them on my shelves back here. The person who gets credit for having really documented and amazing, just the work that she's done is our friend Hatun Tash.
Yes.
And she's incredible. But yeah, so I guess one of the things that I would say about that, and this is going to the work of Shadi Nasser, who is, it's great work. He in his first book describes the process by which the readings were chosen in the first place. Number one, you had different regional variations in the way that things were being read, the way the vowels were being applied to the consonants.
Yeah.
And these regional variations, it was felt needed to be, they were being transferred through transmitter. So you'd have a teacher and a student. And so the student would, anyway, that's how they're named. But according to Shadi Nasser, his findings were that the authoritative readings were not chosen based upon their strength or the likelihood that they were original, but rather based upon wanting things from different regions and based upon their popularity. which is, I mean, you and I know popularity may be a good way of choosing, I don't know what kind of ice cream flavor you like or something
Yeah.
like that. But in determining matters of truth, popularity is not always the best
Yeah.
guide. So, so that's kind of interesting to me. But in terms of the readings, yes, I mean those are differences. There are a bunch of them. If you were to look at all those, I don't know. I mean, I think about this a little bit more because to me, because the earliest manuscripts didn't have consonants, I'm sorry, vowels applied to them in the first place. If I were looking at it as well, if I were looking at it as a Muslim, I don't know if I would. Well, I don't know how big a problem that would be for me in terms of. Well, I guess it kind of would. I'm sorry, I'm thinking out loud here because if you believe the text was orally revealed and the pronunciation is part of the revelation, then it's very important.
Yeah.
If it was a textual transmission and the way it was written down the first time, which I think has its own set of problems, then well, the consonants weren't there in the first place. What's the big deal? It's like the verses in the Bible. The verse numbers didn't exist in the earliest manuscripts.
Right.
Even the spaces between words.
Right.
You take the Greek, the Codex Sinaiticus, all the Greek letters are completely bunched together.
Yeah.
So the separations and the verse numbers and all that stuff is a later thing. So I would almost look at the vowels being applied in a similar way, but I don't think that's the way Muslims look at it or think about it. They think of it as being oral and going back to the origin, to the origin.
Right. Yeah, and I think the same can be applied to, I mean, the ancient Hebrew text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. They don't have diacritical points, and the Masorets, of course, later on, as you know, the Masorets gave us the Masoretic text, and about
they did
9th century. Yeah, thank God they did. Yes, they added all that. But what I find interesting as well, Dan, is that, I mean, we do have a critical apparatus of the Greek New Testament. We have the Nestle Island 28, we got the UPS, and of course the Hebrew as well. The Hebrew Bible, the Biblia Studentia. We've got a critical apparatus. But to your knowledge, Dan, do you know of any Quran that has a critical apparatus? I mean, anywhere? I've not seen it. I've seen. Some have commentary, like Yusuf Ali.
Yeah. No, nothing like that. I've developed an apparatus myself, and I presented it a couple of years ago at a conference, and have been working on it. I'm working on also some other features that just simply don't exist for such an apparatus as well, and maybe I think other people might be working on similar things. So, yes, I am working toward a true critical edition that would allow what those two that you mentioned do is they allow in the apparatus you have the text at the top of the page, and then at the bottom, which is the larger portion, typically, you got one there.
I got an example here. It's just an example of the there's the Greek New Testament there. So
the Greek. So you have so at the bottom there, and that one actually the apparatus at the bottom isn't. It's
that's the Greek New Testament.
So that stuff at the bottom they have different little codes and symbols that tell you if there's a variation. It tells you what the variation is and what manuscript or manuscripts it exists in. And it's a little bit of a technical challenge. It's always a bit of a technical challenge. I think the technical challenge is a little bit different with the Quran. So I think I've got it partly figured out how to represent that well. I mean, you can do a lot of things if you have multiple colors and stuff like that. I'm just trying to do it as elegantly as possible. I'd like to do it in just a single color. A lot of people are thinking about doing this in using the digital tools that are now available. I like the printed page, and so I'm trying to do it as elegantly as I can on a printed page. So but in answer to your question, no, I'm not aware of any true critical edition that exists at this moment.
Right. And talking about the Hafs, so 1924 in Cairo, Egypt, they submerged a whole bunch of Qurans in the Nile. And since 1924, I believe and one of the reasons they said was a lot of the students were complaining about different readings in Al-Azhar University, which is considered the standard Sunni university in the world, in Cairo, Egypt, and the students were complaining about these different readings, and so 1924, I believe, is when they basically officially put out the Hafs. And I just had it reminded me, it was like a deja vu of Uthman again. So Uthman burned it, and this time they used water to submerge these other manuscripts. And I believe it went through another revision several centuries after Muhammad. I don't know if it was Al-Hajjaj, I'm not sure, but there was apparently another standardization that took place.
Yeah, there've been a couple.
Yeah. And so can you maybe speak towards that? I mean, and I know Jay Smith has brought this up in a number of his debates about the 1924 standardization of the Hafs version.
Yeah, it's interesting. It must have been maybe 5 or even 5 or 6 years ago now. Probably about 5 years ago. I was at the AAR SBL Ix conference, and Marijn van Putten was there. He and I were together or something like that, and we sat down, and I don't know whether it was I or he, but we agreed that this whole story, I think something's been published on it since then, but at that moment, there wasn't a good research telling of that story of the 1924 Quran.
Yeah.
And so, he said, we should do this. We should write this up and get it out there. Now, I think that there's even been another. I think 1985 they did some other, but I don't know the nature of the standardization of it. And actually, I do have a pre-1924 Quran that I picked up at a flea market in Cairo.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, until that time, I think that they were reading. I mean, that one is it is the Hafs text, and beyond that, well, anyway, it became popular, and it started to be used, because of its popularity. Once again, you have a situation in which it was the popularity. It wasn't particularly because it was determined by scholars to be the best or the most authoritative one. It was, it became popular, and so they made it the standard. That's my understanding of it. Again, with the modern Qurans, I don't really have a dog in this fight. I just, I'm following what has happened over the years.
Right.
Maybe that's not the best terminology to use, dog, but I don't have necessarily a stake in it as a person.
Right.
To care which Quran they choose to use.
Right.
So.
Right. And so you must have heard of this as well in your research, Dan, about Ibn Masud's Quran. They say it had 111 surahs. He didn't have Surah Al-Fatiha, and I think the last two surahs were missing. And
114, 113, 114.
Yeah.
And Fatiha,
yeah, and that Ubay bin Ka'b, I think, had 2 extra surahs. He had 116. And yet, Ubay bin Ka'b was said by Muhammad to be the best reciter of the Quran, and that if you want to learn the Quran from anyone, you should go to Ubay bin Ka'b. He was the first, but there's also Ibn Masud and others. Well, why do you think, again, talking about this idea that the Quran has always been a homogeneous text, always been the same, what do you think about Ubay bin Ka'b's 2 additional surahs?
Well, I mean, okay. So if you hear a differing account like that, you have to remember also that, I mean, I think it's interesting. It has to be taken seriously.
Sure.
Anytime. So you can think, how could such an alternate account exist? And one possibility is that somebody was sore that their party didn't prevail in the matter, and so they made up a damaging story about somebody else. And it's I don't, or it could be that that was what really happened, that you had these differing, which I think is actually probably more likely, you have differing editions of what the Quran was. And, that, by the way, would harmonize with the idea of Uthman having to standardize.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you have different, now I'm not sure if that, I'd have to go and reread. I'm not sure if that is incorporated in the account of the standardization, but
Right.
I mean, that seems to fit with the early story about the need for it much more than the idea of the differing qira'at or different readings.
Right. There is a significant a variant that I think it was in Ibn Masud or Ubay bin Ka'b, in Surah 33, where adoption is abolished there. And then it says that the wives of the prophet are mothers to the believers. And I think there's a variant that says, and Muhammad, he is your father. I think the standard Hafs does not include that, if I'm not mistaken. But
yeah, so what's that passage became the topic. That single passage became the topic of David Powers.
Yes. I was thinking of David Powers. Yes.
Yeah. So he wrote the book, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men.
Correct.
It's really,
that's right. I read it. Great book.
It's very technical, but it's also really interesting because, in fact, he was looking for manuscripts that had some variation of that verse, because there was a change in a word that made it possible to say that there's no adoption in Islam. And his argument is that it was very important that Zayd not to be considered the son of Muhammad, because it was important the line of hereditary succession to sons died with Muhammad.
Right.
So you had no question of a continuation of prophecy. And for that reason, he alleges that it was a political necessity that caused a need to alter the Quran itself, which is, I mean, it's a fascinating thing.
Yeah.
Aside from the whole story of Zayd in the first place.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
So I was actually in St. Petersburg working at the National Library of Russia, and I came across an interesting correction that involved that word. So I don't know if I contacted him immediately, or within a couple of days I contacted him.
Okay.
And he had only recently also become aware of it. So I guess somebody beat me to the punch, but yeah, so this is the kind of things that, you kind of come up with a theory and you see if you can find evidence to support it, or you modify it or whatever. But
Dr. Powers is I can't help it, Dan, every time I see his name. I think Dr. Bernie Powers in Melbourne School of Theology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't help but think of Austin Powers. Mr. Powers.
Three different people, I think. Yes.
But it's interesting because I read his book. I was fascinated by it because in that book, David Powers argues that that's why you have the claim there that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, that the buck stops here with him. There is no prophet after him. And so if Zayd was rightfully his son by adoption, then if the prophet died, then the question would arise that Zayd would be the legitimate heir to the prophethood, and you got a little bit of that in the Shia, right, with the idea of the Ali and the house of the house of the prophet and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another interesting variant I also find, just talking about Ubay bin Ka'b, I was fascinated by in Surah 61 verse 6, where in the Hafs version and most others, they have the alleged prophecy of Jesus, where he says, I come to announce the coming of a messenger whose name is Ahmad. But in the Ubay bin Ka'b, in his version, and I'm quoting here, it says, "O children of Israel," this is Jesus speaking, "I am God's messenger, and I announced you a prophet and Nabi, whose community, Ummah, will be the last community, and by which God will put a seal on prophets, Nabayun, and messengers, Rasul." So it's quite interesting that in Ubay bin Ka'b's version, he mentions not just a prophet, but he speaks of this community. that will be the last community. So I just found that a very interesting variant, as it doesn't mention Ahmed in Ubay bin Ka'b's recension.
Yeah, I mean the Ahmed thing. What we're encountering here, I think, are different attempts to place Muhammad into. I mean, he's by any measure, he's an outsider. He's not a Hebrew prophet.
No,
he's a descendant. According, if he existed, he is a descendant of Ishmael, and most likely, and that's there are no other biblical prophets that are in that line. So he had a real uphill climb, and then of course, coming after Jesus, and who performed many miracles, and truly confirming, and was the Old Testament is full, the Hebrew Bible is full of very clear prophecies, pointing toward him.
Yeah.
And now you have somebody like Muhammad, where the best you can do is Deuteronomy 18, which, I mean, if you even read the chapter, you can see it clearly does not refer to Muhammad. So that Ahmed thing, the name Muhammad, I don't know. It's I don't blame those who are bring forward these things too, because you're looking for some confirmation that this is the real deal, and you got to take what you have, and that's pretty thin pickings. But.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing you said there, Dan, about Muhammad not being a Hebrew prophet, because Surah 7:157, where it talks about that they will find the unlettered prophet in the Torah and the Injil, in the law and the gospel. And the word there, al-Ummi, they say, well, it means illiterate, but it's been argued that it could also mean a Gentile prophet, a prophet who is not in line of succession with the Hebrew prophets that make up a huge portion of the prophets in the Qur'an.
Yeah, so the word ummi is related to the word ummah, by the way.
Yeah.
And the word ummah means, the community or the people. Ummi could also mean just I think, I mean, the way I read it, it could mean, a man of the people, a common man, for example, or it could mean, like a Gentile, somebody who's.
Yeah.
But so the contention that must mean that he was illiterate is also pretty tenuous.
Mm-hmm.
It's also not, well, it's not necessary to read it that way. And secondly, if you look at the biography of Muhammad, which I know the biography itself is there are a lot of things that we don't know about it, where it originated, how far back it goes, and even according to the traditional account, I mean, the recension that we have from Ibn Hisham would have been more than 200 years after Muhammad's death, is an eternity if you're trying to report the events through an oral transmission. But that having been said, the biography of Muhammad does refer in a couple of places. I found, I saw them when I read through the biography, that it talks about him having written a letter.
Yes.
So, which would make sense. I mean, if he's a trader in the caravan trade, he would be writing receipts and things. I mean, the Quran, nobody asserts that he was, maybe he was illiterate. I don't know, but he was clearly an intelligent man, and I don't see any Muslim asserting otherwise.
Yeah. I mean, he signed. Sorry, Danny. I was just going to add, he signed the Treaty of Hudaybah, right? I mean, he signed it.
Yeah.
And also, before he died, we're told in the Hadith that he asked for some writing material to give some final instructions.
Yeah.
While he was on his deathbed. So that does not sound to me like a man who's illiterate, who can't write or read.
Yeah. And even for the moment, if we assume that he was illiterate, that he couldn't read and write, I don't see anywhere in the literature a claim that he was unintelligent.
Mm-hmm.
So let's imagine that we have an orally delivered, orally transmitted text, purely oral, nothing written down.
Yeah.
Once again, you're in a situation where, okay, where's the miracle? So this guy who can't read and write can recite. Well, of course he could recite. He could speak.
Yeah.
So anyway, these are the things that kind of roll through my head when I'm
being critically minded. Yes.
Yeah.
And even the seal of the prophets, right? I mean, when you look at the hadith, that to the way the Sunnis take it is, well, this means he's the final prophet. But there's hadith saying that the seal of the prophet was actually a bodily mark that Muhammad had on his body. One of them explains it as a mole in between his shoulder blades.
Yeah.
That even goes so far as to say it looked like a partridge egg, and it was speckled. And some of them would even say it was hairy. So, and so you have to ask the question, well, what does that, does seal mean final prophet, or does it mean that he had a mark on his body that was associated? Well, the pagan Arabs, I guess, would associate it with someone who is a soothsayer or some type of a divine poet.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a lot more like something like that. I'm not aware of anything in the Bible where any of the prophets were discerned by a mark on their body.
Right.
You were discerned by, there were tests. Interestingly, there are tests for a prophet. They're clear tests that are laid out in the Bible. And interestingly, Muhammad was bothered and didn't want to be tested in that way. And he spoke of the Jews who asked questions.
Yeah.
That was the thing. Oh no, the Jews are asking questions. But of course, they were trying to discern whether what he was saying, whether he was a prophet of God.
Yeah.
And if you think of how many false prophets there are out there, that's what you should do anytime it's prophecy. So
exactly.
The fact, just to make an analogy, because I just went through there's an interesting video, but I was volunteering. We just had our election here, and I was volunteering at the polls on election day.
Yes, and I'm very happy for you. I'm very happy for
Thank you.
The president incumbent. Yes. Yeah.
We had signs that were printed that we put up at the polling place. They were all properly, stating, and they had the legal statement at the bottom of who had produced the signs. Everything, it was checked out with the election board and so forth. And these signs merely stated the U.S. law that if you are not a citizen, you cannot vote in a U.S. election.
Yeah.
It's written in English and it's written in Spanish. Well, the reason that I'm telling you this is going to make sense in a second.
Sure.
The Democrats who were volunteering outside the polls got really mad that those signs were up. And so they were taken down for a short time, and then it was confirmed by the electoral board that they could go back up. So we put them back up, and they came over and kicked down the sign. Once it was confirmed that they could be there, they put their signs for Biden, Harris, and Tim Kaine up in front of it, so you couldn't read this text. And eventually, after moving it a couple times, I just let it stand. But the reason I tell this story is there's something that action tells you. And that is, why do the people on that side not want people to know that you can't vote if you're not a citizen? So when it comes, and I think the obvious inference is that they are counting on people who are not citizens fraudulently, feloniously casting a vote.
Right.
So in the case of Muhammad, you have to ask the question, why did he not want to be cross-examined as a prophet and tested as a prophet and confirmed as a prophet? I mean, if you can get the Jewish people who know to say, wow, we've put you through our examination, and we believe you're a prophet. That's a pretty big win. And you would think that that would be something you would want to do. So anyway, just thinking about, you have to think through what we see told to us and what lies behind it.
Right. And so as a scholar, Dan, you would say, if someone were to ask you, Dr. Brubaker, do you believe that the Quran that we have today is the same Quran that Gabriel dictated to Muhammad, that was then copied down by his scribes and so forth? From your expert opinion, your academic experience, what would your answer be that to this allegation that the Quran is a preserved text, unchanged since the time of the Prophet?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say that there is zero possibility that the Quran was dictated to, at least as we have it, was dictated to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because God does not lie.
Right.
God does not. So, but that having been said, let's assume that or let's rephrase the question and say, was whatever was written down in the 7th century, is it what we have today? Textually. And I would say that cannot be known at this point. And one of the reasons it cannot be known is that we have variations from what we have today represented in the manuscripts of the 7th century. Which one was the one that was original and which one was not?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. How can you determine that?
Mm-hmm.
Typically with biblical manuscripts, you would look for the earliest manuscript to generally be the more authoritative. There are a couple of instances in which a later manuscript is seen as being more authoritative, and there are reasons for that. But typically, it's the earliest one that is seen as the correct.
Mm-hmm.
And when we go back to that son of palimpsest that we were talking about earlier, the process that we just mentioned would probably require you to accept something that's different from what we have today as the more authoritative one.
Right. Right.
So,
right. And so the differences are not just different readings. We're talking about actual word changes, like the son of palimpsest shows us that there are actual word changes. So for those who are joining us, a palimpsest is a manuscript that was written and then it was erased. It was scrubbed off. The former text was scrubbed off, and then they wrote over it. So that's what we mean by a palimpsest. But getting back to the question, Dan, so we're not just talking about it was just different pronunciations, but that there were real changes in actual wording.
That's right. And incidentally, the manuscript that is pictured on the cover of this book and that is discussed in, I don't know, I think it's change number 5. Let me just confirm that. Yeah, example 5. That is one page out of a 12-page, 11 or 12 pages of a small, it's fairly small, but that one also contains entire words that are different from what we have in the Quran today. In some cases, synonyms or other words that fit in the context that are entirely different. And in at least one case, I think a couple of cases, there are words that the word order is switched. So, and that's not as early as the son of palimpsest either. So there are, it's not unheard of to find these kind of bigger variations that are not represented in the Qur'an literature or the Masahif literature. I mean, remember, the Masahif literature is the one that specifically talks about the manuscripts, whereas the Qur'an talks about the pronunciations.
Right.
So, yeah. So that these kind of things make it difficult to say. Now, in Alta Kulich's refutation of my book, which I kind of grabbed when we were getting ready for this one, he goes through, and I'll show you what he does with each of my changes. He gathers in each case. Over here is my example, and then over here he goes and finds other manuscripts that have the expected, the current form of the rasam in them, and so therefore the argument of this book is that this doesn't matter because these all exist, right? So it's good to have that other information about it. So you could say, well, the preponderance of the evidence means that this is the correct reading. In some cases, those manuscripts are earlier than the one that I cited in the book. And so therefore, by the same argument that we were just talking about, you would say, well, we would prefer the one that we have today because it is represented in the earlier manuscript. And, generally that would be a sound practice. But I don't think it's I don't think it completely does away with the issue. The fact is that you have a variation in a manuscript. In some cases, the variations make sense, like the one I showed you on the front here. There are some that actually they read okay, and so you have to think, well, was there another group of people who are reciting the Quran differently?
Yeah.
And does this represent their recitation preserved on parchment?
Mm-hmm.
And then how do we know that their recitation was not more original or authentic, or the one that Muhammad delivered?
Right.
So yeah, anyway.
So Dan, just maybe one more question, and then we can take some questions if you don't mind from our viewers. So folks, if you have any questions, please put a Q in front of your question, put it in the chat box, and we'll get to your questions. So Dan, just one more question. So the Shias, in the case of the Quran, correct me if I'm wrong, but there were allegations made by some early Shias that references to Ali were removed from the Quran as the legitimate heir to Muhammad. Is there any truth to that? I mean, do the Shias? I'm assuming the Shias have the same Quran as the Sunnis, but I've heard allegations made that even when Uthman produced his recension, the Shias were accusing him of corrupting the text of the Quran.
Yeah, I haven't followed that controversy that much, but I do have some Shia produced manuscripts and materials that I'm only just now starting to go through. So as to whether references to Ali were removed, I'm going to have to delve into that and maybe defer on that question a bit. But I know that the allegation exists.
Right.
I need to take a closer look at what exactly that would look like in the manuscript.
Right. Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, when I dialogue with our Muslim friends, we're not afraid of textual variants. For 400 years, Christianity has been put under a microscope. They've looked at the manuscripts. We know about the woman caught in adultery. We know that it was a later edition. We know about the longer ending in Mark. We're not afraid of these things. But what we're looking for is consistency from our Muslim friends. Is that, look, every manuscript suffers some form of textual corruption in its transmission. And I was just going to mention, of course, this book. It was first published with Bruce Metzger, the text of the New Testament, and it's the subtitles. It's Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration. And of course, we have Bart Ehrman, and Bart Ehrman was a student of Bruce Metzger. So we're not. Yeah, there you go. Great minds think alike. So there you go, Dan. I mean, we're not afraid to admit that. Yeah, look, we do have these variants, but they don't undermine our faith in Christ, and we expect that. God never promised that the copyists of the Bible. He never promised that these human copyists that came after the scriptures. He never said that they would be infallible or be inerrant. We believe in the original autographs being inerrant, but there's nothing in scripture that seems to suggest that other scribes would come along and they would be equally inerrant as Ezekiel and Daniel and Isaiah and Matthew and Paul, etc. So we don't have an issue with that. And so I think when our Muslim friends talk about inspiration, there's a bit of equivocation going on, because they're thinking that the Bible came together the same way the Quran did, which is this tanzil, it came down and so forth. Whereas with us, we believe it came through a 1600-year period, written over 40 different authors, different geographical locations, and the fact that God brought all that together, all the 66 volumes into this divine encyclopedia. We have a different view of inspiration than our Muslim friends do. So I think part of the problem is we're talking past each other instead of to each other.
That's part of it. And there's one other little detail that I think is important that I didn't mention before. And that is the environment in which the copies, of course, the New Testament is 6 centuries earlier than the Quran. But the environment in which the New Testament was transmitted after it was first written was, for a good period of time, was very hostile to the Christians. It was dangerous to own a manuscript in many cases. The people doing the writing of these manuscripts were not professionals. They were lay people who wanted to have their own copy.
Yeah.
So a lot of the variations that you find are spelling errors or grammar errors. These are not in every cases. I mean, education back then was not what it is now. Even now, we have have our problems, don't we? But
Yeah. Yeah.
the major difference that people should also understand is that, the Arab conquests of the 7th century swept through, and
Yeah.
they quickly colonized,
Yeah.
the Levant, the area that we call, Israel, and
So,
and
then you mean it's not just the white people that colonized? There's Arabs.
no, they swept through, and they first, conquered the urban areas, the cities and the towns, and then across North Africa and so forth.
Yeah.
And then eventually they spread out in the countrysides, but they did that. But the point is that they were in political power. And so most of these Quran manuscripts were produced typically, as far as we can discern, by professional scribes and under the authority of the ruling powers. So in a situation like that, you would almost expect, you would think that there would be a bit of a higher standard. So you wouldn't even expect as many of the variations as you find in New Testament manuscripts. So it's just something people should also keep in mind.
Right. Right. And also, when the New Testament manuscripts were being produced, there was no Uthman. They didn't have a central, headquarters where you had the caliph standardizing a text. I mean, with the Christian manuscripts, they were kind of spread throughout the Mediterranean Levant, and so there was no control. There's no central control over the production of these manuscripts. And so what is so funny is when we hear our Muslim friends say, well, the Jews and the Christians went into their Bibles and they removed references to Muhammad.
How did you do
that? They're scattered all over the place. That'd be quite a feat to gather all of these and go through each one of them and expunge these references to Muhammad. So there's a lot of fiction there. So maybe we can take some questions, Dan, if you don't mind. So folks, if you have any questions for Dr. Brubaker, please put a Q in front of your question. We have someone, let's see, Kanu Sapak. Thank you for your research. I would like to know, are you writing a response to Dr. Artikulich and another book on corrections in early manuscripts? When can we expect them?
Yes. The answer to the first question is yes. It was fairly well written, and then I kind of laid it aside to do another couple projects. There are all these different projects that have urgency in front of me, and I know that one's important. It's not actually a very difficult thing to respond to what he's done there. His approach isn't that, but it does need a book. I agree, it does need a book. I published an article that is, I think, should be sufficient to respond to him. But I don't think it was entirely clear to everybody that laid to rest the questions that he raises. So in answer to that, yes, it's coming. I have a book that is due to be released in about a week. Not on this topic. I'm sorry to get everybody excited for a moment there by mentioning it. But that is next in the pipeline, along with another small book on corrections, small book, like the first one, like a continuation of that. And then, of course, the big academic book. I think it's fair to say I have a history of promising things or stating my intentions, and then people get excited, and then everything takes longer. But I think it's reasonable to expect a book on a Quran topic in 2025 from me.
That's great. And I know exactly what you're talking about, Dan, when it comes to books and just the work involved, the editorial, the page layout, and then rereading it, combing through it. I've got a book coming out very soon. You've probably seen it on Facebook, No King But Christ. And so my wife's just combed through it, and now we're in the final stages, and I'm hoping to have it out very soon. Definitely before Christmas. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, yeah. We have another question from Pseudo Jerome of Prague for Dr. Brubaker. Do you hold to the traditional idea that Uthman canonized the Quran, or do you think Shoemaker is correct in suggesting a later date?
I am familiar. I was with Stephen Shoemaker at a conference 2.5 years ago, and his book was not yet published then. I have his book. I've not yet made my way through it. I have spoken with people who have. I have thumbed it myself. He has done a nice job, from what I can tell, of sort of compiling a lot of the existing material that is out there, and taking a few steps, in asserting something. So. He suggests a later date. I haven't read his argument yet on that, so I know I'm a little bit behind the curve on that. But it would be wrong for me to give an opinion on that, since I haven't really fully considered it.
Right. And according to the Hadith, Dan, we're looking at the Uthmanic recension would have been at 20 to 25 years after Muhammad's death, around there.
Yeah, that's about right. When would it have been? He was 656, I think, is when he died. So yeah, by that date, it would have been
right. Okay.
So and by the way, his recent I think they're I'm highly suspicious of some details of that story in the first place.
Yeah,
but it is interesting. Anytime you have, it's like, for example, in the Bible, you have things that are unusual there. For example, the women finding Jesus, finding the empty tomb.
Yeah,
that's a great example of, like, if you were fabricating that story, you wouldn't have put that detail in there, because at least at the time that would have made it harder for people to believe.
Sure.
Count. Sure. So anytime you see something that appears to be damaging to, or appears unusual, or possibly potentially harmful to, what you have to at least treat it seriously as a possible thing.
Right.
It's an evidence. In fact, that's an evidence, I think, that the New Testament is authentic to me.
Yeah. It's called the criterion of embarrassment.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what leads me to believe as well that the episode of the Satanic Verses, that's another criterion of embarrassment, that I don't know how any Muslim could come up with this idea that Satan threw words into Muhammad's mouth, and that Muhammad didn't know the difference between the voice of Gabriel, and the voice of Shaitan. So Ibn Ashaq mentions that. It's mentioned in other sources as well. And doctoral work has been done on it. I forgot the name of that scholar who wrote on the Satanic Verses, I think at the University of Michigan. And he, unfortunately, he passed away. But anyway, he proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Satanic Verses were authentic. It was believed by the early community. Yeah. Later, they rejected it, and most Muslims today would say it's poppycock, as the English say. But I think, based on the criterion of embarrassment, that really happened. I can't see any Muslim coming up with such a story.
Yeah. There was something else I was going to say about that. Maybe it'll come to me. Sorry about that.
I get those as well, Dan. So, yeah, I get those as well. I guess it's our aging. Yeah.
Yes.
We have another one, Pseudo Jerome. Do you think we eventually discover another Quranic text type in addition to the Uthmanic and Sana, perhaps a tradition based on Ibn Masud or Ubay bin Ka'b?
That would be nice. There are, by the way, there are a lot of early Qur'an manuscripts out there. I'm aware of. I have reports. I've had reports for years of a very good collection in Iraq that I've not had a chance to visit, that I think were preserved. Thankfully, that were preserved during the Iraq War.
Okay.
And I know that there are a lot of them in Iran, which, because of the situation in the world now, I mean, I had once hoped to travel there and be able to look at manuscripts, get an invitation, and so forth. I'm not sure whether the relationship between our countries right now would allow that, and and so forth. But I would. The point is, whether it's myself doing it, I visited some. There are some in Uzbekistan. I did go there.
Okay.
But the point is that there are a lot of manuscripts yet to be studied, and it would not surprise me if we, just find, these haven't been cataloged. The Rasam hasn't been recorded on so many of these. So, it's basically a treasure trove, and we're going to have a lot more, I think, in the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah. It's exciting. Looking forward to that. Okay, we do have Pseudo-Jerome does have a lot of good questions here. I think we may have touched on this already, Dan. What are your thoughts on the early Shia accusations against the canonical Quran?
I am aware, but I have not read too much of the Shia material. I know that it's very important. I've really focused my attention on the manuscripts themselves and not so much the controversy surrounding them. All those are, when it comes time to say, okay, I've gathered all this data, and now what does it mean? That's when, reading those things like the accusations and the traditions and the secondary literature can be helpful, because you can say, okay, this theory actually brings some sense to what I'm seeing on the page. But again, I'm sorry, I don't really have an opinion on the on what you're mentioning there, because I haven't really looked at it that closely.
Yeah, fair enough. And he just wants to express his thanks. I guess this is my private Ask Dr. Brubaker. Thank you for your work, sir, and may Christ bless you.
Thank you. And by the way, I love Prague. We went there. My wife and I went there.
Yeah.
We spent Christmas there in 1997, I think. It was a wonderful time. My sister was living there at the time.
Looking forward to it. I'm going to be in Florida, by the way, Dan. So I'll be heading down for Christmas for Florida for at least 2 weeks. And hopefully we don't get another hurricane.
Yes. I think we're past it now. So you should be all right.
Thank God. Yeah. We have Karen Fisher, smaller book or tract would be great. I have purchased many of Dr. Brubaker's books to give to Muslims who insist the Quran has never been changed, not a dot or a letter. And that's great, Karen. And again, I would encourage you folks that are watching, if you look in the description box, I provided a link to Dr. Brubaker's books. So if you are brand spanking new to this, I would recommend the smaller book on, is it the 20 changes, Dr. Brubaker?
Yes.
Yeah, I would highly recommend that. It's a very, very important book, a very important work. And so really avail yourselves of this because these are really important in your outreach to our Muslim friends. Okay.
And by the way, Karen is a friend and a former student. And so,
wonderful.
Hello, Karen. Greetings.
Wonderful. Glad to have her along. Wonderful. So we'll take a few more questions, Dan, and then we could probably call it a night. So again, we have Pseudo-Jerome of Prague. Why was there such an emphasis on getting one standard text in later Islamic history when the example of the Early Qur'ān and Muhammad's, they seem more polyvalent?
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing that you see, we've talked a lot about the biblical manuscript, and the biblical manuscripts seem to go out like this. You get more variation over time, and it's actually the exact opposite with the Quran. You see a movement toward conformity.
Right.
And really, my work with corrections in the manuscripts is evidence of that happening. It was felt that polyvalence was inappropriate, and so let's take care of it by changing the manuscripts themselves.
Right.
So why was there such an emphasis? I think it, again, has to do with, in my perception, it has to do with the honor-shame dynamic. Mm-hmm. And so there's a certain amount of shame, particularly given modern arguments for the Quran's preservation. There's a certain amount of shame associated with the existence of any sort of variation, which, again, I don't think it should be unusual that variation exists in the manuscripts, but if I were to guess, I think that's what would be driving it.
Right. Okay. Kanusapik, I've heard of claims there are Syriac-Aramaic writings that predate the Quran, but are basically Quranic material. Any insights or thoughts on this?
Yeah. So Christoph Luxemburg is the main. Gunther Luling wrote his doctoral thesis on that topic, and then Christoph Luxemburg, it's a pseudonym, but he wrote the book, The Sero-Aramaic Origins of the Quran, originally, I believe, in French, and then it's available in English translation as well. it's a very, very technical book. And I have a bit of Syriac myself, but it is very, I think there's possibly something to it, because one of the problems with the Quran, is anybody here, those here who are somewhat familiar with it, is that you have a text that really kind of feels like, it refers to people that we know from the Bible. It tells stories sort of that, exist in the Bible, while changing key details.
Mhm.
And then there are things in it that just, words that even the early Muslim exegetes were, at a loss to say what they meant. It's really, for its claim to have been mubin,
Yeah, clear.
a clear text, it doesn't seem to fit the bill of that description. And so what the people who've studied the Sero-Aramaic origins have alleged, as near as I can summarize it, is that these texts were early, were Christian materials, hymns, and so forth, that the Syriac text got transferred over into an Arabic form,
Mhm.
and then read in Arabic without a full understanding of a linguistic understanding of the juncture of these two languages, and that resulted in a certain loss of meaning or change of meaning that made it look like made it sort of lose its appearance of Christian origins.
Mhm.
I don't know if I'm doing justice to the thesis, but I think there's a lot of power. I mean, it's in the region. If you look at the examples that they give, it seems pretty powerful to me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and even the worship practices, I believe, of the Aramaic Christians and Syriac Christians, Syriac/Aramaic, a lot of them involve prostration in their worship.
mhm.
And so it's quite interesting, because we keep hearing Muslims say, "Oh, you Christians don't prostrate when you pray, and we prostrate to Allah and so forth." But the tradition in the Syriac Aramaic churches, there's a long tradition of prostration and worship, and so some have speculated that the Muslims may have imitated that by looking at the Syriac Christians.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
So an example that he gives here is Surah Fatiha, actually written in Aramaic prior to Muhammad's birth, used in churches, etc. So that
Mm.
I'm not familiar with.
Where's that written about? If the questioner can just tell me.
Yeah, yeah. So if you can clarify that, then Dr. Brubaker will be able to provide a fuller answer to your question. Yeah. We do have a question from Morgay321. What made you want to write a book about this particular subject, Quran manuscript corrections, and who else have written about it before you?
Yeah. Well, I wrote a book about it because it was my doctoral topic. And so maybe behind the question is, why did I choose that as my doctoral topic? So I'll answer that question. I chose a topic. I became aware of some of these issues in Quran manuscripts from the 1st and 2nd century during the course of my preliminary work for my doctorate. And I thought it was really interesting. And I discovered that nobody had really focused on that as a topic. And also, my personality is such that if I'm going to do something in life with these limited number of years that I have, I want to do something that's, that is meaningful. And so I didn't want to focus on some esoteric aspect of Islam that really doesn't matter to anybody's life. The Quran, because it deals with, ultimate questions, I think it's a very worthy topic for cross-examination. And so I chose that, and it led to my dissertation, and my dissertation led to my little book, and hopefully it'll lead to more things as well. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah. Okay, so Kanu Sepik says a Christian polemic. Rob Christian made this claim in one of his videos on YouTube. So,
Okay.
yeah, I think what you're looking for, Dan, is you're looking for documentation, evidence.
Yeah.
Written.
Well, yeah, I'm sure it's written about somewhere. I just did off the top. I don't know exactly where that was. So, yeah, if you find out and want to forward that information to me, I'd be happy to read the article or whatever.
Right. So Dan, maybe I could end by asking you this question. What do you think? What value do you think is there in learning about these corrections and variants in the Quran? What value do you think there is in our Christian witness to our Muslim friends? Because we're called to love our neighbor. We're called to make disciples of all the nations, which includes the Muslim people as well. So what would you say if someone's watching this and saying, okay, well, how can this aid me in my Christian witness to my Muslim neighbor?
My easy answer to that is it opens a door for conversation. It creates questions that what you need with your Muslim friends is the opportunity to discuss these questions of ultimate importance. And what happens, what I have noticed, even within the Quran itself, the Quran asserts very early in Surah 2 that it is the book in which there is no doubt, or there's no doubt in it. When you assert from the start, it's called in logic, it's called an a priori argument. You assume from the start that something is true, and I don't think that's. I think most Muslims have never asked the question, was Muhammad a prophet? And that question really does need to be asked and considered. Now, you may consider the evidence, and I find it unlikely, but you may consider the evidence and conclude, yeah, he was a prophet. But to just assume from the outset, if somebody comes to you and says, I don't know, it makes it. If you go into a bank and you say, I want to take money out of my account, my name is so and so, my name is Bill Gates. They're going to want to see your ID proving that you're Bill Gates, right? So maybe I could self-identify, but but the same way, you want to know what the authority is of the person before you trust the person. So the manuscripts I found when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I would be sitting on an airplane typing away on my computer, and I have the Arabic text on my screen, and from very often I would have a Muslim sitting next to me. One time I had a Muslim on both sides of me, and they would look over and they'd go, "Oh, wow, this is neat." And then they'd look at the page, and I'd show them what's going on it. And then they start to put two and two together and realize that this isn't, the Quran that I know, it's different.
Right.
And so you see the wheels turning, but, I didn't. And the answer to the question is it can open doors for you to have just a good conversation with a Muslim friend who needs to hear the gospel and consider the gospel and respond to the gospel. Yeah. So that's that. And you can also learn about their text and their world as well. And, it goes both ways. So, be open. There's nothing to be afraid of. And I think if you look, very openly at the Quran, I'm not afraid of anybody who really understands the material and the Quran of ever becoming a Muslim. I think the problem is when people don't understand and they kind of take these popular assertions and take them as gospel truth, so to speak. And that's where the stuff comes. But no, learn about it, read it, study it. You'll be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. The clincher for me, Dan, was Surah 25, Surah Al-Furqan, and the criterion. And it was really the charge of the unbelievers that were saying, we've heard all this before. These are just tales of the ancients. And the Quran
there, says, right in the text, you have that admission, right?
Yeah. I mean, a number of times too, not just there in Surah 16 as well. But I just find it interesting that the kafir, the kafirun, the unbelievers are saying, hey, Muhammad, this is nothing new. We've heard this all before. The Quran responds by saying, no, it has been revealed by him who knows the secrets. And that, for me, I think was the clincher, because, all the stories that we find in the Quran, the seven sleepers of Ephesus, Jesus speaking from the cradle, making clay birds, and God raising Mount Sinai over the Israelites. We know they're pre-Islamic. We know where they come from. So when I looked at that, I thought, you know what, the unbelievers were actually right. They were actually right. And, the answer that the Muslim's supposed to give is no. These are actually, they come down from Allah. They're revealed. And to me, that was the clincher. That, I think, showed Muhammad's true colors, that, the fact that he's being accused of he's all ears, as they said, and he's being accused of of copying things and so forth. I that to me, I think, confirmed that, Muhammad could not possibly be a prophet from God.
Yeah. Well, there's also I'm writing a couple of interestingly, I forgot to mention this, a couple of children's books.
Oh, great.
They're dealing with some of these questions as well. So
nice.
Just as a side, there's a little teaser. You'll see those as they come out. But,
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Well, Dr. Brubaker, thank you so much for giving us your time tonight. And this is just exciting, your research, and we just appreciate that, and your love for the gospel as well. So thank you so much, and for being here and responding to questions. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you to everybody who's watching. I hope it's been helpful to you. I appreciate and happy to spend the time.
Thank you. And to all our American friends, and including you, Dan, happy Thanksgiving, and blessings to you. Until next time, God bless. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Dan.